For 31 years, it had been Frances Dell's job to be the one who arrived after, the woman with the cameras who came up the road while the smoke was still deciding which way to go, and she had learned in those years that a photograph does not do what people believe it does. People believe a photograph tells the truth, and it does not. A photograph tells you only what the light was doing at 1/500th of a second on one particular morning, and the whole of her trade, the part that took 30 years and not 30 days, was learning to stand in the exact right place at that 1/500th of a second so that the truth happened to fall inside the edges of the frame. People called her Frankie, had called her that since she was a girl carrying a school newspaper's borrowed Nikon, and by the end she was the last darkroom photographer at the last daily paper in a county that used to have 3 of them, developing her own film in a closet that smelled of fixer, while the young ones shot everything on phones and wondered aloud, kindly, why she bothered. She bothered because film could not be quietly changed after the fact the way a file could, because a negative was a physical object that either showed a thing or did not, because you could hold a strip of it up to a bare bulb 30 years later, and the grain would still be sitting exactly where the light had put it, and she had testified twice in her life, once in a fire and once in a beating, that a negative in her own hand had not been touched between the shutter and the courtroom, and both times a lawyer had tried to make that sound like a small thing, and both times she had known it was the largest thing in the room. She could read a print the way other people read a face. She could tell a contact print from an enlargement by the bite of the grain. She could tell available light from a flash by the way the shadows fell under a chin. She could look at a photograph somebody swore was one moment and see the 2 moments it actually was. The seam where a careful hand had married 2 negatives, because a doubled shadow does not lie, light comes from one place at a time, and a photograph with its shadows pointing 2 directions is a photograph that has been asked to say something the morning did not say. She knew that the camera is a machine for keeping, that it does not care who is rich, that it will put the banker and the drunk in the same silver with the same indifference, and she knew the darker half of that too, which is that a photograph is only as honest as the man who chooses which frame to print and which to slide back into the sleeve, and that the whole history of her trade, from the very beginning, was 2 histories laid over each other, the pictures that were shown and the pictures that were kept in the drawer, and that the drawer, always, was where the town actually lived. 31 years of that, and then the paper was sold in the spring to a chain that ran 9 other little papers off one desk in a city 400 miles away. And a man not yet 40 flew in for a single afternoon and explained to the 7 remaining employees that the darkroom was a liability under the new insurance, and that the photography would henceforth be, he used the word, sourced, and he said the word buyout the way you would name a small mercy, and Frankie Dell stood in the doorway of the only trade she had ever had, holding a cardboard box with an enlarger timer and a coffee mug in it, and she was 61 years old. Her husband had been gone by then 2 years, not to another woman and not to any drama the town could chew on, only to the ordinary theft of an ordinary cancer that took 9 months and left her a mortgage she could not carry alone, and a silence in the evenings that no radio ever quite filled. And by the following autumn, the house was sold to pay what the treatments had not, and she was living in the upstairs half of a divided house on the edge of a town where everyone knew her, which is its own kind of loneliness, and she had a little under $3,000 and a paid-off truck and a habit she had brought home from 30 years of scanners, of coming full awake at odd hours with her heart going as though a call had come in, though no call came anymore, and it was into that life, that particular flat gray autumn of a life gone quiet, that the dead studios came. It started as work, The only work she could find, a historical society 2 counties over, had inherited the entire plate archive of a studio that had photographed a river town from 1892 until the last owner died, and they needed somebody who knew glass, who could handle a dry plate negative without shearing the emulsion off it, who could tell a collodion from a gelatin plate and knew that you clean the glass side and never, ever the image side. And there was exactly one such person available for the wages they could pay. And Frankie took it and spent a winter in a church basement bringing the faces of a dead town up out of boxes into the light of a scanner. And somewhere in that winter, the thing happened to her that happens to a certain kind of person only once or twice in a life. She found her second calling at an age when most people are counting down to the end of their first. Because a studio archive is not a pile of pictures, she came to understand it is the single most complete record a small town ever makes of itself and never means to. The courthouse keeps the deeds and the church keeps the marriages. But the photographer keeps the faces. Everybody comes to the photographer eventually. The bride and the corpse and the soldier and the baby. The storekeeper wanting his new front photographed. The family wanting the farm shot before the bank took it. And unlike the courthouse, the photographer keeps the failures too. The plate that did not sell, the second exposure, the man who came to be photographed with a woman who was not his wife. All of it sleeved and shelved and numbered in a back room, and Frankie Dell, going through 8,000 plates of a town she had never lived in, understood that she was reading its true book, the one it had not known it was writing. And she was never after that quite able to drive through a dying town without slowing down to see whether the studio building was still standing. Which is how she came to Coldwater. She was driving home from the river town on a 2-lane in the low-folded country in the south of the state, the part where the land stops being flat and starts to wrinkle into hills too poor to farm well and too pretty to leave, where the towns sit in the creases with their grain elevators and their 1 steeple and their 2 streets, and she came down a grade into a place the map called Coldwater. Selkirk County, population by the faded sign 411, and she did what she always did now. She slowed, and there on the main street, in a row of brick storefronts, half of them boarded, stood a building that stopped her the way certain buildings did. A 2-story commercial block of dark red brick with a cast iron cornice and set into the whole south face of its upper floor. Where no ordinary store would ever put a window, a great slanted bank of glass, filthy and cracked and boarded in patches but unmistakable, a photographer's north light, a skylight built to catch the one steady, unchanging light in the sky and pour it down onto opposing floor, and Frankie Dell pulled her truck to the curb of the empty street and sat looking up at it. And she knew before she read a single word that she was looking at a studio, and that it had been shut a very long time, and that nobody had cared enough to tear the glass out, and the not caring, she would think later, was the first clue. Because in her experience, the buildings a town leaves alone the longest are not the ones it has forgotten, they are the ones it is trying to. The name was still on the glass of the ground floor door in gold leaf, gone to brown, Rourke, and under it in smaller letters Portraits Views Commercial, and the ground floor had been a good many things since. She could see the ghosts of them, a feed store, an insurance office, a thrift shop with its hand-lettered sign still leaned in the window, but the upstairs had a stillness to it. A boarded permanence that told her the studio proper had not been anything since it had stopped being itself. She got out and cupped her hands to the dusty glass of the door and saw a stair going up into the dark, and she stood a while in the empty street with the wind coming down it off the hills, and a woman crossing to the post office slowed and looked at her the way a town looks at a stranger studying the wrong building, not hostile exactly, but attentive, filing her. And Frankie tipped her head to the woman and got back in the truck, but she did not drive on. She drove the 4 blocks to the Selkirk County seat's little branch clerk that Coldwater kept open 2 days a week, and she asked the question she had learned to ask: who owns the Rourke block? And the clerk, a bored young man glad of anything, looked it up and told her that the Rourke block was owned by nobody, that it had gone to the county for taxes going on 11 years ago when the last thrift shop tenant died, that it was condemned, that it was in fact on the county surplus list to be sold at the next quarterly tax auction for the back taxes owed, which came, he said, running his finger down a column, to a minimum bid of $4. And Frankie Dell said, $4. And the young man said, $4. Nobody's going to bid on it, honey. It's got a bad roof and a condemned placard and no plumbing that works. The county would about pay you to take it. And Frankie went out and stood on the sidewalk in front of the studio again and looked up at the great slanted north light going gold now in the falling afternoon. And she thought about a back room she had not seen yet and could already feel, the way you feel a held breath in a house. And she thought, a photographer worked here for how many years, and where are his plates? And she did not have an answer, and the not having of it was the exact sensation she had been missing since the paper let her go. The pull of a thing that wants finding, and she went home and she did not sleep, and at the next quarterly auction, held in the basement of the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning in October, with 9 other people bidding on mineral rights and a dead man's boat, she raised her hand for the Rourke block of Coldwater, and she paid $4 for it. 1 bill and 4 quarters, because she wanted to feel it leave her hand, and the auctioneer said sold with the small contempt auctioneers keep for lots nobody wants. And Frances Dell became, at 61, with a little under $3,000 to her name and no trade the world still wanted, the owner of a condemned building and everything sealed inside it. She could have walked away from it as a folly and been only $4 poorer. She understood that later, standing in places she never meant to stand. But the county attorney's clerk had handed her the deed and a photocopied condemnation notice across the counter, and the old woman who was the register of deeds, a heavy, calm woman near 70 with reading glasses on a beaded chain, had come out of the back to watch the recording the way certain officials will surface for a thing that touches an old nerve. And when the paper was stamped, she had said to Frankie, mildly, over the glasses, "You're the first person in 40 years to buy that building because you wanted it." And Frankie said, "Who wanted it the other times?" And the Register of Deeds looked at her a moment, weighing something, and said, "The ones who wanted it gone, and would not sell it to them for that same reason. The county, I mean. A county does not like to be the one holding the match." And then she seemed to feel she had said a half sentence too much, and she squared the deed on the counter and pushed it over and said only, "The roof's bad. Don't go up on the 2nd floor without you tell somebody where you are," and went back into her records. And Frankie Dell stood in the courthouse hall turning that over. The ones who wanted it gone. A county does not like to be the one holding the match. Because in 31 years of arriving after she had learned that officials do not reach for the word match by accident. And she folded the deed into her coat and went to find some coffee and, without quite admitting it to herself, the town's index, because a courthouse keeps a town's paper, but a diner keeps its index, and she had never once failed to find it open. The diner in Coldwater was called the Elevator, after the grain elevator it faced, 6 booths and a counter and a pie case, and Frankie took a stool and ordered the coffee and the special and let herself be looked at, which is the price of the index, and she had not been there 10 minutes before a man 2 stools down, elderly, in a feed cap, said the thing that a town cannot help saying to a stranger, said, "You're the lady bought the old studio." And Frankie said, "Word travels," and he said, 4 blocks and a phone line is all the travel it needs around here. And there was a low, friendly laugh down the counter, and for a few minutes it was easy. They asked what she meant to do with it. She said she wasn't sure. She said she used to be a photographer, which pleased them. A photographer buying the photographer's building. There was a rightness to it they liked. And then the man in the cap said, well, Emmett Rourke would be glad somebody in the trade got it and not one of them that just wanted it down. And Frankie, gently, because she had done this 10,000 times, said, who wanted it down? And it was as though she had let a draft into the room. It was not that the talk stopped. It was that the talk softened. The way a field softens under a cloud, the four oldest people at the counter and in the near booth did not go silent so much as they went careful, a leaning away without any bodies moving, and the man in the cap said, ah, that's old business, and turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, and a woman in the booth said too brightly that the pie today was the rhubarb, and Frankie Dell, who had felt that exact change of weather in 40 diners and 40 courthouses in her life, sat very still inside it and knew it for what it was. The particular quiet of people who are in the presence of a subject, and she did not push on it. You never push on it the first day, you only mark where it lives, and she marked it, and she drank her coffee and praised the rhubarb and paid, and it was on her way to the door that the day gave her its second gift, because a big-shouldered younger man in a canvas coat who had been eating alone in the last booth got up and followed her out into the street and said, ma'am. And when she turned, he stuck out a hand the size of a supper plate and said, Calbrame. I do the propane and about half the fixing in this town, and I heard you bought the Rourke place, and if you're going up in it, you're going to want a hand and some tools. That roof's let water into the back for years, and them stairs are a question, and I'll tell you the truth. I've wanted to see inside that building since I was a boy, and Frankie liked him instantly, the way you like an honest dog, and she said she'd be glad of the help, and they stood a minute making the arrangements of it, and it was over his shoulder that she saw the other thing, a man come out of the hardware 2 doors down and stop on the sidewalk and watch the two of them talk. An upright, hard-faced man of maybe 70 in a good canvas coat and a clean seed cap, not doing anything, only watching, with his arms folded, and when Calbreme noticed him, he lifted a hand in a neighborly way, and the man did not lift one back, only looked a moment longer and turned and went the other way up the street. And Frankie said, who's that? And Calbreme's easy face did a small complicated thing, and he said, that's Boyd Teller. His people go back here to the start. His granddad was the law in this county 50 years. Don't mind him. And Frankie, filing, said, he didn't look like a man with nothing on his mind. And Cal said, Boyd's all right. He just gets his back up when folks take an interest in old Coldwater business. And there was that word again, business. The town's own word for the thing under the floor, and Frankie Dell drove home in the dark that night, knowing 3 things the way she had known them at the start of every real story of her life. That the studio's back room was sealed and full. That the town went soft and careful at a single name. And that a hard old man with the law in his blood had folded his arms on a sidewalk at the mere sight of her, and that the 3 of them together made a shape, and the shape kept her awake past the hour her dead husband used to reach over and tell her to let it go until morning. Before she asked a single living person a single question about the fire she did not yet know was a fire, she went through her building, because that was her order, learned young. You look at the evidence before you take the testimony, so that the testimony cannot tell you what to see. And on a bright cold morning, 2 days later, Calbreme met her at the Rourke block with a milk crate of tools and a work light on a cord and a look on his face like a boy at the door of a thing forbidden his whole life, and they went up. The stair was sound enough at the sides where the stringers held, and they went up close to the wall the way you do, and came out through a door at the top into the studio proper, and both of them stopped, because it was a room that made you stop. It ran the whole depth of the upper floor, 40 feet of it, and the great slanted north light filled the south wall from waist height to the ceiling, and even boarded in patches and grimed with 80 years of dust, the light came down through it gray and even and soft. The light Emmett Rourke had built the whole building to catch, the one light that never changes through a day. And it fell now on a room that had simply been left, not looted, left, and Frankie Dell walked into it the way she walked into an archive, slow, touching nothing, reading. The posing floor was there, a raised platform of oak worn pale, where 100 years of feet had stood to be made permanent, and behind it, on rollers hung from the ceiling, the painted backdrops still hung in their ranks. Cracked and rotting at the hems, but readable, a Grecian balustrade with a painted garden beyond it, a snowy birch wood, a plain marbled gray for the serious portraits, and Frankie rolled one down on its complaining pulley and thought of all the brides who had stood against it, and of the man behind the camera saying, "Hold still," and the town coming to him one at a time to be kept. The camera was gone, but its great cast iron stand remained, and the posing chair, and against the north wall the long counter where the retouching had been done, and on it a jar of dried spotting colors and a sable brush worn to nothing, and a magnifier on a jointed arm, the small tools of the part of the trade Frankie knew in her own hands. And she picked up the dead brush and put it down again gently, because it was like finding a stranger who had done your same work in your same way a lifetime before you were born. But it was the back of the room she had come for, and she went to it. There was a partition across the back third of the floor, and in it 2 doors, and the first was an ordinary door standing open on a small office. A roll-top desk with its slats jammed, a safe with its door hanging open and empty, a wall of pigeonholes stuffed with the yellowed brie of a business, order envelopes, a calendar for 1952 with a girl and a bottle of soda on it, and Frankie noted the calendar, 1952, and went to the second door, and the second door was the one. It was set in the partition where the dark room would have to be, on the inside wall away from all light, and it was not like the other doors. It was a heavy door, and it had been screwed shut. She could see the heads of the screws driven through the stile into the frame, a dozen of them, sunk and painted over, and the whole seam of it had been puttied and painted more than once. Coat on coat until door and frame were one skin, and Frankie knelt and put her work light close and low and raked it across the surface the way you raise a watermark, and under the last coat of paint she found what she had known she would find, the ghost of the word that had been stenciled on the panel and painted out. Darkroom. 2 words. And she sat back on her heels in the gray even light, and Calbrain said, from behind her, softly, "Well, why in the world would a man screw shut and paint over his own darkroom?" And Frankie Dell said, "That's the right question," and did not answer it because she did not yet know. But her heart was going the way it went, and she put her palm flat on the painted door the way you would put a hand on a horse to let it know you were there. And she said, "Not to Cal, to the door, all right." And she did not open it, not that day and not for 2 weeks. Because 31 years had taught her that the wrong first touch on a sealed thing costs you what you cannot buy back, that a room like this one might have to be evidence someday, and evidence is a chain you do not break at the first link out of. Eagerness, and so instead she did what she truly knew how to do. She photographed the sealed door from 8 angles with a scale beside it, and she measured it, and she shot the screws in raking light so their painting over was on record, and then she went home and she went to the free places, the newspaper scans and the county's digitized deed books and the state historical index and the genealogy boards where the descendants of a dead town keep their dead, and she spent 9 days walking the Rourke studio and the town of Coldwater backward through the record, and by the 9th night she knew the shape of it, and the shape was worse than she had let herself expect, and it had a fire in it after all. Emmett Rourke, she learned, had come to Coldwater in 1912. A young man with a view camera and alone, and had photographed the town for 40 years. Every soldier of 2 wars, every graduating class, every new storefront, the paving of the main street, the building of the very bank that faced his studio, and he had been, besides the portrait man, the town's commercial photographer, which meant he was the man the newspaper hired to shoot a wreck or a flood or a fire, and the man the insurance companies hired to document a loss, and Frankie, who had done exactly that same double work herself for 31 years, understood at once the position that put a man in, because the insurance photographer is the one person at a disaster whose pictures decide money. And where pictures decide money, there is always someone who would like to choose the frame. He had closed the studio in 1952. The calendar had told her true, retired at 66 and moved, the notices said, to a daughter's in another state. And he had died there in 1960, and here was the first small wrong note. Because a photographer who retires sells his archive or gives it to the town or leaves it to the historical society, a lifetime of plates is a man's whole estate and his one bid at being remembered, and there was no record anywhere that Emmett Rourke's plates had gone anywhere at all. No gift to the county, no sale, no fire, nothing. The plates simply stopped being mentioned. As though a man had photographed a town for 40 years and then swallowed the pictures, and Frankie Dell, sitting in her divided house at 2 a.m, said out loud, "They're behind the door." Because where else would 40 years of glass be but screwed shut and painted over in the one room built to hold them? And then she found the fire. It was not hard to find once she knew the family to look for, because Cal Bream had let a name slip on the second day of tools without meaning to, had said, when she asked him what the oldest folks meant by old Coldwater business, that he guessed they meant the Roe fire, that there'd been a bad fire back in the 30s, a woman killed, and her husband, Cal said. Lowering his voice in a room where there was no one to overhear, her husband got sent up for it. They said he said it, and Frankie had written the word Roe in her head in block capitals and gone looking, and the little dead newspapers gave it to her in their flat cold type across the winter of 1936. On the night of the 4th of February, 1936. In the worst cold of that winter, the frame building on the corner of Main and Sabine that held Roe's grocery on the ground floor and the Roe family's rooms above it had burned to the sills between midnight and dawn, and Ivy Roe, 29 years old, had died in the upstairs, and her husband, Silas Roe, 33, the grocer, had been pulled from the snow of the back lot in his nightclothes with his hands and face burned, alive, and their one child, a girl of 10, had not been in the building, having been sent the evening before to stay the week with her grandmother 2 miles out in the country, which was the one mercy in the whole account, and Frankie would come to understand, the hinge the rest of it turned on. And the paper over the following weeks told the town story of it, and the town story was this, that Silas Roe was a man from off, an outsider who had come to Coldwater only 6 years before and bought the grocery cheap, that the grocery had been failing, that Silas Roe had taken a fire policy on the building and the stock the autumn before, that the fire had started in the store below and not in the family rooms, and that Silas Roe had been found outside, saved, while his wife had died within, and out of those hard bare facts the county had built a case that the failing outsider had set his own store to collect the insurance and had gotten out and had meant or had not troubled to prevent that his wife would not. And by April of 1936, Silas Roe was tried in the Selkirk County Courthouse for arson and for the murder of his wife, and Frankie read the trial coverage twice. Slowly, the way she read a print for its seam, and the seam was there. She could feel it before she could name it, and then she found it, in the list of the state's exhibits printed dutifully in the paper of that week. Exhibit 11, Exhibit 12, Exhibit 13, photographs of the ruin and the point of origin, made by E. Rourke, commercial photographer, and Frankie Dell sat very still because the man whose sealed darkroom she owned had made the pictures that had helped hang the case on Silas Row, and had then, 16 years later, screwed that darkroom shut and painted out its name and let 40 years of his life be swallowed rather than pass into any other hands. And a photographer does not seal his own eyes shut over a job well done. And she knew then, the way she had known things at the start of the two hardest stories of her working life, that whatever was behind that door was not going to let her sleep until she had. Yet in the gray even light, and was reading it, and that she was not, whatever she told Cal Bream or the Register of Deeds or herself, in Coldwater any longer for a building. Boyd Teller came to find her before she went looking for anyone, which was itself a kind of answer. She was at the elevator diner on a gray noon, eating a bowl of the soup and reading a printout of the trial coverage she had not bothered to hide, and the hard, upright old man in the clean seed cap came in and did not sit at the counter. He came to her booth and stood over it and said, "May I?" and sat without waiting and folded his big hands on the table and looked at the printout turned toward him on the formica and then at her, and he said, "I'm going to say a thing to you one time, neighbor to neighbor, and be done." And Frankie set down her spoon and gave him the whole of her attention, because a man does not rehearse a speech in his truck and carry it into a diner over a thing that does not matter to him. "Whatever you think you're going to do with that building," he said, "fix it up, sell it, make one of them ghost tours out of it. You go right on and do. That's your $4 in your business. But there is a certain kind of person in this town, always has been, that likes to dig up 60-year-old mud every time that corner gets mentioned. Old talk, poison talk. About a man that was tried fair and found guilty by 12 men of this county for burning his own wife alive. And it was settled then, and it is settled now. And if you go up and down, asking your questions and lending your ear to the ones that never accepted the verdict, you will be picking up a stick that wiser people than you have had the good sense to leave lie in the grass. And you will hurt folks that are still living for the sake of a man that has been justly dead for 80 years. And I'd think better of you than that." And Frankie Dell looked at him, at the folded hands and the set jaw and the eyes that would not quite hold hers, and she had sat across from perhaps 200 angry people in her working life. The ones defending a thing they had seen with their own eyes, and the ones defending a thing they had only been handed, and she knew the difference in her body before her mind could say it. And Boyd Teller had the loud, brittle word, perfect certainty of the second kind, a man reciting a verdict he had inherited the way he had inherited the good coat and the family pew. And she said, mildly, "Mr. Teller, you seem to know a great deal about a case I only bought a building next to." And Boyd Teller's face closed a further notch, and he said, "My grandfather was the sheriff that arrested him, and my father was proud of it his whole life, and that will do for why I know it." And Frankie said, still mild, "And your grandfather, was he at the fire, or did he come after?" And Boyd Teller stood up so hard the table jumped and the soup rocked in the bowl, and he said, "You have a good day," and put $2 on the table for a lunch he had not eaten, and walked out. And Frankie Dell watched him cross the empty street to his truck and sit in it a moment without starting it. And she thought, as she had thought 100 times in her life, that in all her years the single most reliable way to learn that a man was buried in the wrong ground had always been another man driving out of his day to warn her that he was not. She asked the woman at the register of the diner, the 60-year-old who had watched the whole exchange from behind the pie case with a rag going slower and slower in her hand, one question, she asked. "Is there anybody still living that was here in the 30s that would remember the Row fire firsthand And the woman stopped wiping the counter and looked at Frankie a long moment. And something moved behind her face that was half warning and half a thing that had been waiting a great many years to be asked. And she said, quietly, glancing once at the door Boyd Teller had gone out of, "There's Ruby." And Frankie said, "Ruby." And the woman said, "Ruby Rowe, honey, the little girl that was out at her grandmother's the night it burned. She's 99 years old, and she still lives in the same house at the south edge of town she's lived in her whole life, and she's the reason there's any talk at all, because she has never once in 90 years let anybody tell her that her father did." And Frankie said, "The little girl, she's alive." And the woman said, "Alive and sharp as a tack and lonesome as a fence post. And I will tell you what nobody in this town will tell you to your face. That girl has been right there her whole life, waiting for somebody with no dog in this fight to walk up her steps and ask her. And everybody her age is too ashamed, and everybody my age is too scared. And you go on and go and tell her Marcel from the diner sent you." And Frankie Dell paid her bill and drove to the south edge of town. The house was low and white and very old, set back from the road behind a picket fence and a garden turned under for the winter, tidy in the way of a place kept by someone who has nothing to do but keep it. And there was a garden tractor under a lean-to with its mower deck washed clean. And Frankie went up the walk, and before she reached the top step, the door opened. Because the old woman had been watching the road, and the woman who stood in the doorway was very small and very straight, thin as a rake handle, in a man's flannel shirt and a cardigan and canvas trousers, cuffed twice at the ankle, with white hair braided and pinned up, and a face that was all fine bone, and two pale blue eyes that went over Frankie once, head to boots. The way you would read a page. And before Frankie could get out one word of the careful things she had prepared, the old woman said, "You're the one bought the studio." And Frankie said yes, and Ruby Rowe said, "And you've been in it, and you found his darkroom screwed shut." And Frankie said, "I did, 4 days ago." And Ruby Rowe closed her eyes for just a moment. An ancient woman standing straight in a cold doorway with her eyes shut, and when she opened them, she stepped back and held the storm door wide and said, "Then you had better come in. I have been waiting 60 years for somebody to find that door, and I had commenced to think I would have to die first and haunt one of these cowards into it." The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and liniment and wood smoke, and there was one photograph on the wall by the window that faced north toward the town, a small oval-framed print. A young woman in a light dress with dark hair pinned up and a soft, laughing mouth, standing on the steps of a storefront with her hand shading her eyes. And Ruby Rowe poured 2 cups of coffee with a hand that did not shake and set them down and lowered herself into a chair across the oilcloth from Frankie and said, "That is my mother. That is Ivy. Emmett Rourke made that picture on the steps of our store the summer before, and it is the only one I have, because everything else we owned burned, and I am going to tell you the whole of it now. In order, the way it happened, and you are not going to say one comforting word to me while I do it, because comfort is what people offer you when they have quietly decided that the other thing, the truth, the setting right, is never coming. And I have not decided that. I have never once decided that. And I am 99 years old." And then she told it, and Frankie Dell, who had taken testimony her whole life, sat still and let her, and did not reach for a pen, because some testimony you do not interrupt with a pen. "You have to understand first what my father was in this town," Ruby said, "because everything else grows out of it. He was an outsider, and there is no crime in a town like this one worse than that. He came from up north in 1930 with a little money, and my mother, who was a local girl, an Alcott, and he bought Dunmore's grocery when it failed, and he was a good grocer and a better man. He carried half the county on credit through the worst of the Depression. He let the Vances and the Pettits And yes, the tellers run tabs a year long and never once posted a name. And you would think that would have made him loved, and it did not. It made him watched. Because a man from off who is kind is more suspicious to a frightened town than a man from off who is hard. They cannot place him, and the times were terrible, and a grocery that carries the whole town on credit is a grocery that is itself always one bad month from the wall. And by the winter of 1936, he was behind on the note. And the note, Ruby said, and here her voice did the thing her sister's voice would have done if she had had a sister. It did not soften, it tightened. The note on our building was held by the bank, and the bank was Merrick's Bank. And I am going to say that name to you plain, because I have spent 90 years not being allowed to say it above a whisper. Leland Merrick, who came to Coldwater the same decade my father did, and who by 1936 had got his hand on the throat of every dollar in this valley, and who wanted our corner, Main and Sabine, the best corner in town, because he had it in his head to pull down the old frame buildings and put up a brick bank block with a hotel over it, and he built exactly that, Miss Dell, in 1938. On our ashes, the Merrick Building, it is still standing. It is the finest building in this town. The Historical Society is in the lobby of it, and there is a bronze plaque by the door with Leland Merrick's face on it that the school children walked past, and Frankie Dell said nothing because she had been told not to, but something in her went very cold and very level. The way it did when a story stopped being sad and started being a machine. He came to my father twice that January, Ruby said. I know it because my mother told my grandmother, and my grandmother told me when I was grown. He came and offered to buy the corner and take up the note, and my father said no, because the store was his one thing and my mother's people were there. And the second time Leland Merrick left our steps, he said a thing my mother never forgot. He said, "This is a hard winter for a man to be stubborn in." And 11 days later, our building burned. And I was not in it, Ruby said. And that is the fact the whole rest of my life has hung from. Because I was 10 years old, and I had the croup, and my mother had sent me the day before out to my grandmother's in the country where the air was better. And so I was 2 miles away asleep under 3 quilts when the corner of Main and Sabin went up, and my mother, who would have carried me out first the way she carried everything for everyone first, had only herself to think of and did not get out, and my father woke in the smoke and could not get up the inside stair because the fire was in the store below coming up, and he went out the back and around and tried to go up the outside stair to the rooms, and the men that were gathering held him back. 4 men held my father in the snow while he tried to go into that fire after my mother, and one of the men that held him, Ruby said, and looked at Frankie, was Boyd Teller's grandfather, the sheriff. And by dawn my mother was dead in the ashes, and my father was burned, and my father was, before the ground even cooled, the suspect. And I want you to sit with the shape of that, Miss Dell. A man is held back from running into a fire to save his wife by the very man who will arrest him 3 days later for setting it. They said he set it for the insurance, she said. They said the failing outsider burned his own store for the policy, and they made much of the policy. And Miss Dell, my father, took that fire policy in October at the insistence of the bank. It was a condition of the note. Merrick's own bank required the building be insured to the bank's benefit. They made my father buy the rope they hanged him with, and then they hanged him with it. And they said he set the fire in the store and got himself out the back and left my mother to die. And they said, because they had to say something about me being safe out at my grandmother's. They said he had sent me away a purpose, that he had planned it, that a man who would send his own sick child to safety and then burn his wife was a devil. And that, Ruby said, that was the thing that finished him with the jury, my one mercy, my croup, my grandmother's clean air. They took the one loving thing my mother did that week, and they turned it into the proof of my father's blackest. Calculation, and there is no forgiving a town for that. There is only outliving your rage at it. which I have mostly done, mostly. He was tried in April, she said, and the case was photographs and the policy and the word outsider, and the photographs were Emmett Rourke's, and I will come to Emmett Rourke, because Emmett Rourke is the whole reason you are sitting in my kitchen. But I will come to him in his place, in order, because he has earned that much from me. God help me, he has earned that. My father was found guilty in 2 hours, she said, and the judge gave him life rather than the rope. And I have wondered all my days whether that judge had a grain of doubt in him, and that life sentence was the size of it. 1 grain, not enough to acquit, enough to flinch from killing. And my father went to the state penitentiary in the spring of 1936, and he died there in the winter of 1941. Of the lung, they said, of a broken everything is what I say. 5 years, and in 5 years he wrote me a letter every single week to my grandmother's house, and my grandmother read them to me and kept them, and in not one of the 200 and some letters did that man ever once say he was innocent, because he wrote to me one time, and I have it by heart. A man who has to keep saying he did not do a thing has already lost. Ruby, you will know what your father was without my telling you. And Ruby Rose stopped and looked out the window at the town and said, and I did know. I have never for 1 hour of 90 years not known, and the town has spent 90 years telling me a little girl could not know such a thing, and the town is wrong. The town is a coward, and it is wrong. A child knows who loved her mother. That is the one thing on this earth a child cannot be fooled about. And now, Ruby Rose said, and set her coffee down, now I will tell you about Emmett Rourke, and you will understand why I have kept my sanity these 60 years betting everything on a door. Emmett Rourke made the pictures they used at the trial, she said, Exhibit 11 and 12 and 13, the point of origin they called it, pictures that showed the fire had started low in the store. And the state stood on those pictures, and for 20 years, Miss Dell, I hated Emmett Rourke almost the way I hated Leland Merrick. Because in the mind of a girl, he was the man whose pictures helped kill her father, and I would cross the street from him, and he let me. He never once tried to speak to me. He was a quiet drinking man by then. Everyone knew he drank. Up in that studio, alone with his glass and his plates, after his wife passed, and I thought I knew what his drinking was. I thought it was an ordinary man's ordinary sorrows, and I was wrong. I was so wrong it has taken me my whole life to be ashamed enough of it, because in the fall of 1951, Ruby said I was a grown woman of 25 by then, unmarried, I never did marry, who would marry the arsonist's daughter in a town this size. And I was crossing in front of the studio, and Emmett Rourke came out of his door, and he had been drinking. I could smell it, and he stopped square in front of me on the sidewalk, so I could not go around, and he was an old man crying right there on Main Street in the afternoon, and he took my hand, and he pressed something into it, a photograph, a little contact print, and it was this one. And Ruby Rose reached up without rising and took the oval frame off the wall and laid it on the oilcloth between them. The young laughing woman on the store steps, that is the print he gave me, my mother alive on our own steps. I had nothing of her face, and he gave me her face. And he held my hand shut around it, and he said, and I have carried these words for 74 years, he said. There was more, child, I made more that morning than they ever showed, and I could not, and I kept it. I kept all of it. It is all still where it is safe. And one day, somebody with clean hands and nothing to lose is going to open that room. And then he let go of my hand and went back inside and shut the door. And he never spoke to me again. And the next spring, he screwed that darkroom shut and painted over the name and moved away to his daughters and died. And I stood on that sidewalk, Miss Dell, 25 years old, holding my mother's face and those words, and I have stood on it ever since. I did not understand it all at once, she said. I was young and angry, and I half thought it was a drunk man's guilt talking, but the words would not leave me. There was more. I made more than they showed. And as I got older and quieter and learned to think the way you must have learned to think in your work, I understood what he had told me. He had told me that Emmett Rourke, the insurance photographer, had stood in the ashes of my mother's death on the morning of the 5th of February 1936 and had made a full honest record the way an honest craftsman does, every plate, the whole scene, and that somewhere in that full record was the truth, and that he had been made to bring only the 3 plates that could be turned against my father, and that he had known the morning he made them, and he had done it anyway, and then he had spent the rest of his life unable to destroy the plates that would have saved my father, and unable to bring them into the light, and had sealed them up and left them for a braver hand. And that, Miss Dell, is the door in your building, and I have been 99 years old for 3 weeks now. And I am asking you, when do we open it? Frankie Dell sat in the warm kitchen a long moment, and then she broke the one rule the old woman had set. Gently, because it had to be broken, she said, "Mrs. Rowe." And Ruby said, "It was never Mrs., I told you." And Frankie said, "Ruby, then, I have to tell you the truth about what may be behind that door, because I have opened rooms like it before, and sometimes the thing that was sealed is gone, taken, or rotted, or was never as much as the waiting made it, and I will not open it with you standing there believing on it if you cannot bear for it to be empty." And Ruby Rowe looked at her with the 2 pale eyes and said, "I have borne everything else. And if it is empty, I will have lost nothing but a hope I have carried so long it weighs nothing anymore. But I do not think it is empty, Miss Dell, because a man does not screw shut and paint over and abandon an empty room. You said that yourself to the propane man. Cal Bream tells his aunt everything, and his aunt tells the whole town. You said, why would a man seal his own darkroom? And there is only the one answer, and we both know it so. When? They opened it on a Thursday. And Frankie Dell did it right, because 31 years does not wash out of a person, and because she understood before anyone else in that town what the room might have to be, which was evidence, in a proceeding that had not yet been imagined by anyone but her, and so she wrote down the date and the hour and the persons present, herself and Ruby Rowe and Cal Bream, and because Frankie had insisted on it over the old woman's objection, a fourth, Marcel from the diner, so that there would be a witness with no stake and no old blood in the matter, and she photographed the sealed door hole and untouched, the screws, the painted seam, the ghost of the stenciled name raised in raking light before a single tool touched it. And then Cal Bream, gentle as a man handling something that might still go off, backed the dozen screws out one at a time, the slots choked with paint, so that he had to clean each one with an awl before the driver would bite, and he scored the paint seam the whole way around the door with a fresh blade, twice, and then he and Frankie worked a flat bar into the seam at top and bottom and eased the door out of its frame the way you would draw a splinter, slow, straight, and it came loose all at once with the little sigh of an old seal breaking, and the room breathed out at them, cold and dry and dark, and it smelled of dust and old iron and the ghost of Fixer, the dark room smell, the smell of Frankie Dell's own whole working life, and she put her light in ahead of her before her body and lifted it, and the 4 of them stood in the doorway and looked into the room that Emmett Rourke had sealed in 1952, and it was not empty. It was full. Along the whole of 2 walls stood the plate files, tall cabinets of narrow drawers, and Frankie drew one open with 2 fingers, and it was packed with glass plates standing on edge in paper sleeves, each sleeve numbered and dated in a small upright hand, and the next drawer and the next, the entire visual record of the town of Coldwater from 1912 to 1952. 40 years of faces, thousands upon thousands of plates, the brides and the corpses and the soldiers and the storefronts, the true book of the town kept in silver on glass, in the one room nobody had opened in 74 years. And Ruby Rowe made a small sound and put her hand on the cabinet as though on a shoulder. And Frankie said, "Quiet. This is the whole town. This is everyone." And then she turned her light to the workbench along the inside wall, the sink and the trays and the enlarger under its dust like a shrouded bird. And at the end of the bench, apart, deliberate, squared to the corner, a black japanned tin box the size of a large Bible with a hasp but no lock, and set on the lid of it, holding it down like a paperweight. A single glass plate on a little wooden stand, positioned so it would be the first thing any hand reaching that corner would touch, and Frankie Dell lifted the plate to her light and turned it to read the negative the way she had read 10,000 negatives, dark for light and light for dark, and she went very still. It was the scene plate. It was a wide plate of the burned corner, made in the flat gray light of the morning after, the whole ruin in it, the fallen front of the store, the standing brick of the chimney, the snow trodden and black around it, and Frankie's eye, trained past 30 years, went where a fireman's or an insurance man's eye goes, to the low back corner of the store where the origin would be. And she saw what Emmett Rourke had seen and could not unsee, and she said, out loud, in the cold room, "Oh," and Ruby Rowe said, "What? Tell me. You promised no comfort, and I am asking for none. Tell me what he made." And Frankie Dell held the plate to the light so the old woman could not read it, but so that she herself could be exact. And she said, "The fire did not start inside. There is a scorch pattern up the outside of the back wall, low, in a fan. The way a fire climbs when it is set from the outside against a wall, not the way it burns when it starts within and eats its way out. And there is a can, Ruby. There is a 5-gallon can lying on its side in the snow of the back lot, in the picture, in the record, plain as a plate can make it. And no can of coal oil walks itself out to the back lot of a burning store. And there is one thing more." And Frankie moved her light and looked and was silent a moment. And Ruby said, "Tell me." And Frankie said, "The plate is a wide one. He framed it wide, wider than the origin needed. And I think he did that on purpose, because a wide frame catches what a narrow one leaves out. And at the far edge of it, at the mouth of the alley that runs behind the corner, there is an automobile stopped, a big, dark, closed automobile of the kind that only one or two men in a town this size in 1936 would have owned. And there is a man standing beside it in a long coat with his back to the ruin, walking away, caught mid-stride, and Emmett Rourke put that in the frame. Ruby. An insurance photographer does not need the alley in his origin shot. He needed it. He framed the truth into the corner of the picture they made him take, and then he kept the plate, and Ruby Rowe stood in the dark doorway of the sealed room and did not weep. She was 99 and past the age when the body spends itself that way. She stood very straight with her hand still on the cabinet full of the town's faces, and she said, in a voice with no age in it at all, "Open the box, Miss Dell." He said there was more. Frankie carried the japanned box to the studio floor where the north light came down gray and even and honest, because she would not read it by a work lamp. And she set it on the retouching counter and put on the cotton gloves she had carried folded in her coat for a week. And she opened the hasp, and inside, wrapped and ordered by a careful hand, was the rest of what Emmett Rourke could not carry and could not burn. There were 9 more plates, sleeved and numbered, the full sequence of the morning after, the can in the snow close up, the fan of scorch up the outside of the back wall, the forced and broken hasp of the back door photographed from 2 feet away, the interior of the ruined store showing the origin low against the outer wall, and not, at the stove or the lamp where an accident would live. And 2 plates of the alley, the closed dark automobile and the man in the long coat, one wide and one that Rourke had enlarged in his own darkroom to bring the automobile up closer, and clipped to that enlargement a strip of paper on which he had written the license number he had read off the plate with a loop, and beneath the plates lay a marbled composition book. And beneath that, a carbon copy of a typed report on the letterhead of a fire insurance company, and beneath that, a single sealed envelope gone soft and yellow at the folds, addressed in the upright white ink hand to whoever opens my room. The composition book was Emmett Rourke's own working log, and Frankie read the entries of February 1936 aloud in the gray light because Ruby asked her to slowly, and they were the flat notes of a working craftsman until they stopped being that, the 5th of February, called to the row corner by the county for the insurance, made 11 plates of the loss, and then, in a hand pressed suddenly small and careful, the origin is not the stove nor any lamp. It is the outside of the north back wall. There is coal oil. There is a can. This store was fired from the lot. I have made it all. And then 2 days later, Mr. M. And the county man came to the studio this evening. I am to bring the 3 interior plates only and no others. The note on this building is at Mr. M's bank and comes due in the spring. They did not need to say the rest. I am ashamed to write that they did not need to say the rest. And then, after the trial, in April it is done, they have taken the row man on my 3 plates and the word of a frightened town, and I have the other 8 in my hand and my mouth stopped by a mortgage. And I am a coward with a clear negative of the truth, which is the worst thing a man of my trade can be. And then, years apart, the entries a man makes to a book because he has no one else, 1941, they write me that the row man has died in the penitentiary. I made his wife's wedding portrait and his child's christening and the picture that could have freed him, and I brought 3. That buried him, and 1951, I gave the girl her mother's face today on the street. I could not give her the rest. I am too old and he is too strong, and it would be her word and a drunk's plates against the finest man in the county. But I have told her it is kept, and I will seal it where time cannot get at it, and neither can I. For the hand that opens, it must be cleaner than mine. And the last entry, 1952, I have sealed the room. Everything is in it, the town entire, and the one truth it would not look at. I could not save the man, and I would not destroy the proof. Let that be the whole of what is written under my name. He could not, and he would not, and Frankie closed the book, and the studio was silent but for the wind working at the great skylight overhead. The insurance carbon confirmed the plainest crime of all in dry columns, that the policy had been written to the benefit of the bank, and that the loss had been paid in full to the bank in the summer of 1936, so that the fire which took Ivy Rowe's life and Silas Rowe's liberty had also cleared the very note Leland Merrick had put in jeopardy, and had left him the paid-off owner of the best corner in Coldwater. And the sealed envelope, when Frankie opened it, was Emmett Rourke's letter to the future, dated the day he sealed the room, and it said, in part, and Frankie read it to the 3 of them standing in the light, I was 40 years the photographer of this town, and I kept its face better than it deserved, and I did it one true morning too many. For I made an honest record of the Rowe fire, and then brought a lying 3 of it into a court, because a frightened man with a mortgage is the easiest tool a rich man owns, and I have carried that morning for 16 years, and I will carry it into the ground, but I will not carry the proof there with me. I am sealing this room, because I have not the courage to open it, and not the wickedness to empty it, and I am trusting to time and to some stranger with cleaner hands than mine, who will owe this town nothing and its great men less, to do the thing I could not, And to that stranger, I say only this: the innocent man's name was Silas Rowe, and he did not fire his store, and he loved his wife. And the guilty man's name is written plain in my log, and his automobile is in my plates, and his money is in that bank across the street, and I am sorry, which is the emptiest word in the language and the only one I have earned, Emmett Rourke. And under it a last line: tell the Rowe girl her mother laughed the day I made her picture. I have never forgotten it. Frankie Dell did the rest the way she had done her whole life's work, in order and on the record. Because a truth that has waited 90 years deserves to be brought in so cleanly that no frightened town can ever send it back out. She had every plate and page photographed and scanned and copied before one item left the studio. She carried a certified set to the county attorney, a young woman 3 years in the office who read for 2 hours without a word and then took off her glasses and said, I have walked past that plaque my whole life. And Frankie mailed a sealed set to the state archives and another to herself, and she took the license number off Emmett Rourke's enlargement to the state's old motor registrations, which are kept forever and are dull and complete, and it came back registered in 1936 to Leland Merrick of Coldwater. And there was no longer any seam left to find. The picture had no doubled shadow in it anywhere. It was all one morning, and it all pointed one way. There was no one left to try. Every soul who could have been charged was 50 and 60 years dead, and Frankie sat with that, the way you sit with the one crooked thing that cannot be made straight, and the young county attorney said it plainest. There is no case, Miss Dell. There is only the record. And Frankie said, then the record will have to do the whole of the work. It is done heavier. It was Iris Merrick who surprised her. Leland Merrick's granddaughter was 74 years old and ran the Merrick Foundation that had paved the county's playgrounds and stocked its library and put the new roof on the very historical society that sat in her grandfather's lobby. And Frankie went to her because it was decent to go to her before the thing was in the paper. And she found not the wall she had braced for, but an old woman who listened to all of it in a still front room, and then sat with her hands in her lap and said, when I was a girl, my grandfather was dying in the upstairs of the Merrick house, and he was past sense at the end, but there was one afternoon he took my wrist, harder than a dying man should have been able, and he said, the pictures. Do not ever let anyone develop the pictures. And I thought it was the morphine. I have thought so for 60 years. And Iris Merrick looked at the plates spread on her own table and said, and it was not the morphine. And then she was quiet a long time and said the thing that told Frankie she was not her grandfather. She said, my whole life has been spent giving this county back money. And I understand now that I never once asked where the first of it came from. And I am 74 years old, and I have a great deal of asking to do very late. And she stood, and she asked to be taken to Ruby Rowe. And in Ruby's warm kitchen, the granddaughter of the man who had burned Ruby's mother sat down across the oilcloth and said, I have no right to your forgiveness, and I have not come for it. I have come because you are owed the truth from a Merrick mouth, and there is only me left to say it. My grandfather killed your mother and framed your father and built our name on it, and I have lived 74 years in the warmth of that fire. And Ruby Rowe looked at her for a long moment and said, at last, you did not do it. And you did not have to come. And you came, sit, the coffee is hot, and that was more than Iris Merrick could bear with her back straight, and she wept, and Ruby let her, which is its own kind of grace, the letting. Boyd Teller came to the studio alone because the county attorney had shown him the two plates side by side. his grandfather's court exhibit that stopped at the origin, and Emmett Rourke's wide plate that did not, the same morning, the same ruin, the one crop narrow to hang a man, and the one kept whole to save him, and Boyd Teller stood at the retouching counter in the gray light and looked at the can in the snow and the automobile in the alley for a long time. And then he sat down on the stool and took off his clean seed cap and held it in his two hands, and he said, not to Frankie, to the plates, 60 years we told it at the table like a thing we were proud of. My granddad caught the man that burned his wife, and my father built me on it, and the paper was up here in this room the whole while, and he did not make an excuse. Frankie gave him that ever after. He sat a while, and then he said, my grandfather held that man in the snow so he could not go in after her, and later put the cuffs on him, and I have always heard the first half told like heroism. And he stood and he asked one thing, does Ruby Rowe take callers? And Frankie said she did. And Boyd Teller went, hat in hand, down the road to the south edge of town. 80 years of Sunday dinners to unsay, and began slowly to unsay them. The record did the work. The state, on a petition the young county attorney wrote and Iris Merrick paid the filing on and Frankie's certified plates carried, granted a posthumous pardon to Silas Rowe in the matter of the Rowe fire, 90 years to the season after his conviction. And the little paper that had printed his guilt in 1936 printed his innocence on its front page under a scan of Emmett Rourke's wide plate, and the bronze plaque came down off the front of the Merrick building by a vote of the county board that no one dared oppose, with Ruby Rowe sitting in the front row in her good cardigan and in its place. At Iris Merrick's own cost and her own asking went a plain bronze that told the whole of it in 11 lines, the fire, the wrong, the names of Ivy and Silas Rowe, and the sentence Ruby chose to end it, this building stands on their corner. Let it stand for the truth this time. The plates, all of them, the 40 years of the town's faces and the 9 that told its worst morning, were accepted into the permanent archive of Selkirk County by a resolution that required them to be kept in the room built for them, in the care of a qualified custodian, and the county had exactly one of those. And so Francis Dell, who had come with $4 and a dead trade, stayed. Keeper of the record of a town not her own, resident in the studio with the great north light, and she scanned the town's whole face up out of the glass and gave it back, and the Historical Society mounted the first exhibit in the Merrick lobby out of Emmett Rourke's plates, and the largest print in it, by Ruby's insistence, was not the fire and not the automobile. It was a young woman laughing on the steps of a store with her hand shading her eyes, Ivy Rowe alive, the summer before, restored. Silas Rowe had lain 85 years in a numbered prison grave in another county, and in the spring, when the ground opened, Iris Merrick brought him home, and they buried what was left of him beside his wife in the Coldwater ground under a stone that gave him back. His name and, beneath it, the line Ruby had waited 90 years to cut in granite. He loved her, and the town said so at last. If you have stayed with me all the way to here, thank you. It means more than you can know. Most of the people listening to this are awake in a quiet house long after midnight, so tell me in the comments tonight what town you are listening from, and whether there is a building on your own main street that everybody agrees, a little too quickly, to leave alone. And before you go, sit with the one thing I cannot put down. Emmett Rourke did the cowardly thing on the morning it counted. He brought the 3 plates that buried an innocent man and kept back the 8 that would have saved him, and he did it to save a mortgage. And no telling of this makes that clean. And then he spent the next 30 years being the only human being alive who kept the proof of his own worst act from dying, sleeving it, numbering it, sealing it in the one room time could not reach, pressing a dead woman's face into her daughter's hand on a street, and finally trusting a stranger not yet born to be braver than he could be. So that every good thing that came right in the end came right only because the man who failed refused to let the proof of his failure be lost. So here is what I would honestly like you to answer tonight. Which one was the real Emmett Rourke? The coward who folded under a rich man, or the keeper who outweighted him by 74 years, and the harder question underneath it? If you had done a thing you could never undo, would you have the courage, not to confess it, that is the easy courage, but to keep the proof of it safe your whole life long, so that someone cleaner than you could one day set it right? Next time on this channel, a retired switchboard operator pays $6 for the shut telephone exchange at the end of a drowned river town and finds the night operator's position still wired and the trouble log still open on its hook, turned to the single night in 1953 that every call in the valley went through one woman's board, and one of those calls was never written down. Subscribe so you are here when that board lights up. It is dark on Main Street in Coldwater now, and cold. And the boards are off the great north light of the Rourke studio, and behind it, late, one window burns a warm gold square over the empty street, where a woman sits at a long counter under an even light with 40 years of a town's faces around her on their shelves, every one of them named now, and every one of them kept, reading the record and keeping it, the way it should have been kept all along.